I never thought betrayal would come dressed in my son's voice, calm and clipped like he was reading a weather report, not dismantling the life I built with my bare hands. But that morning proved me wrong in ways I still ain't recovered from. The knock came early, just past dawn, when the sky was still bruised with sleep and the kettle hadn't even whistled yet. Two officers at the door, polite but firm, asking about my immigration status like I was some stranger squatting in my own damn home. I stood there barefoot, heart thudding like a drum in a funeral march, and listened as they explained someone had anonymously reported me, flagged me as undocumented, a ghost in the system. I didn't need a name. I knew. My son, my own flesh and blood, had been circling my assets like a vulture for months, asking about deeds, insurance, the house I let him live in rent-free, the land I bought with sweat and sacrifice. I'd smiled through it, thinking maybe he was just curious, maybe planning for the future, maybe trying to be responsible. But no, he was planning my exit. What he didn't know was that I'd secured my green card 15 years ago, quietly, without fanfare, because I never wanted to be a burden or a target. I handed the officers my documents, watched their surprise melt into apology, and closed the door with a silence that felt like thunder. I sat down, stared at the wall, and let the betrayal settle in like dust on old furniture, thick and choking. And right here, before I go further, if you're watching this, tell me where you're tuning in from. I want to know who's hearing this story, who's felt this kind of silence, who's tasted betrayal from the hands that once held them. Subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon so you don't miss what's coming next, and drop a comment. What kind of stories do you want to hear? Family betrayal? Hidden truths? Quiet revenge? Because this one's just beginning. I spent the rest of that day gathering every document, every receipt, every proof of the life I'd built. I wasn't going to confront him with anger. I was going to confront him with facts. At the next family gathering, I walked in with a folder and a plan. He smiled like nothing had happened, like he hadn't tried to erase me. His wife looked smug, sipping wine, talking about renovations they wanted to make once the house was theirs. I waited until dessert, then stood up and laid the folder on the table. Green card, property deeds, bank statements, and on top, an eviction notice. His face drained of color, like someone had pulled the plug on his soul. I told him I knew everything, that mercy had its limits, and mine had been crossed. The room went quiet, except for the sound of his daughter's spoon clinking against her bowl. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just told the truth. And the truth, when spoken without apology, is the loudest sound in the world. That night, I slept better than I had in years. But sleep don't erase betrayal. It just puts it in a drawer for the morning. I woke up the next day with a strange calm, like I'd finally stepped out of a storm I didn't know I was in. My phone buzzed with messages, some angry, some confused, some begging me to reconsider. But I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in explanations. I was interested in consequences. My son had made a choice, and choices come with weight. I started the process of transferring ownership of my remaining properties to my daughter, the one who never asked for anything, who showed up with groceries and hugs and silence when I needed it most. She didn't know I was doing it. I wanted it to be a surprise, a reward for loyalty in a world that had forgotten what loyalty meant. Meanwhile, my son scrambled, tried to lawyer up, tried to twist the narrative, but the papers didn't lie. The eviction was legal. The assets were protected. And the betrayal, well, that was permanent. I watched him pack his things, watched his wife glare at me like I'd stolen something from her. And I didn't flinch. I just stood there, arms crossed, heart steady, and let them leave. The house felt lighter after they were gone, like it had exhaled. I walked through the rooms, touched the walls, and remembered the years I spent building this life. The sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the jobs that broke my back, but never my spirit. And I thought about how easy it was for someone I loved to try and erase it all. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't come from enemies. It comes from the ones you fed, clothed, protected. It comes from the ones who know where your heart lives. And when it hits like a train. But I ain't broken. I'm awake. And this story's just getting started. After the eviction, the house felt like it had shed a skin. Lighter, quieter, but not peaceful, not yet. There's a kind of silence that follows betrayal, not the soft kind, but the kind that hums in your bones, that makes the walls feel like they're watching you. I walked through each room, touching the furniture, the photographs, the memories that hadn't betrayed me, and I wondered how long he'd been planning it, how many nights he sat in that living room calculating my disappearance like a spreadsheet. The neighbors started whispering, not because they knew the details, but because they sensed the shift, the way his car vanished overnight, the way I stopped waving at the mailbox, the way my daughter started showing up more often, carrying groceries and quiet comfort. She didn't ask questions. She just sat with me, sometimes in silence, sometimes with stories about her kids, and I realized how much I'd missed her voice in the noise of pretending everything was fine. My son tried calling, once, twice, then not at all. His wife sent a message through her sister, something about misunderstanding, about stress, about how families should forgive. I didn't reply. Forgiveness is earned, not demanded. And betrayal. Betrayal is a debt that takes years to pay off. I started locking the doors more often, not because I feared him, but because I feared the version of myself that might let him back in. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is loud, and I was done being loud. I was surgical now, precise, like a man rebuilding a house after a fire. I met with my lawyer, updated my will, shifted accounts, made sure every corner of my life was sealed tight. My daughter didn't know I was naming her the sole beneficiary. I wanted her to find out later, when the dust had settled, when the echoes had stopped. I started writing again, not letters, not journals, but memories. I wrote about the first time I held my son, the way he cried like he was apologizing for being born. I wrote about the time he broke his arm and clung to me like I was the only thing keeping him alive. I wrote about the day he graduated, the pride that bloomed in my chest like spring. And then I wrote about the day he tried to erase me. I didn't write to forgive. I wrote to remember. Because memory is armor, and I needed armor now. One evening, my daughter brought over an old photo album, the kind with yellowed pages and fingerprints from 100 different moments. We flipped through it slowly, laughing at bad haircuts, pausing at weddings, funerals, birthdays. Then we reached a photo of my son, maybe 10 years old, holding a toy truck, smiling like the world hadn't yet taught him how to lie. I stared at that photo for a long time, and something inside me cracked, not broke, just shifted. I realized I didn't hate him. I hated what he'd become. I hated the greed, the entitlement, the cold calculation. But the boy in that photo, I missed him. I missed the version of him that used to run into my arms, that used to ask me to read him stories, that used to cry when I left for work. That boy was gone, buried under ambition and resentment. And maybe, he'd never come back. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I was moving forward. I started fixing the garden, trimming the hedges, repainting the porch. Neighbors stopped by, complimented the changes, asked if I was okay. I smiled, nodded, said I was just cleaning up. They didn't need the details. The truth was mine. One Sunday, I hosted a small dinner, just my daughter, her kids, a few close friends. We laughed, ate too much, played old music, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to joy. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind, the kind that sits in your chest and hums. After they left, I stood on the porch, watching the stars, and I whispered to the night, I'm still here. Because that's what betrayal tries to do, erase you. But I wasn't erased. I was rewritten. And this new version of me, he's sharper, stronger, and he doesn't forget. Not anymore. It didn't take long for the retaliation to start. Not with fists or fire, but with whispers, with rumors, with the kind of poison that drips slow and steady until it rots the roots. My son, evicted and exposed, didn't disappear quietly. He started telling people I was losing my mind, that I'd forged documents, that the green card was fake, that I was manipulating the family with lies and threats. He knew exactly where to aim, not at my body, but at my reputation, at the legacy I'd spent decades building. I started getting strange looks at the grocery store, neighbors hesitating before waving, old friends suddenly too busy to return calls. It was subtle, but it was there, the shift, the doubt, the shadow he'd cast over my name. My daughter tried to shield me, tried to fight back with truth, but truth don't travel as fast as gossip. I told her to stop, to let the silence speak, because I wasn't going to play his game. I was going to win it. I started collecting everything: emails, texts, voice messages, screenshots. I built a file thicker than a Bible, and I wasn't just saving it. I was preparing it. Because if he wanted war, he'd get it. Quiet, legal, devastating. One night, I got a call from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. He said he'd heard things, ugly things, and wanted to know the truth. I told him everything, not with rage, but with clarity. And when I finished, he was silent for a long time before saying, "He's not the boy you raised." And that hit me harder than any insult. Because it was true. The boy I raised had vanished, replaced by a man who saw blood as currency and family as leverage. I started thinking about legacy, about what I'd leave behind, not just in assets but in memory. I didn't want to be remembered as the man who got betrayed. I wanted to be remembered as the man who stood up, who fought back with dignity, who didn't let bitterness rot his soul. So I started writing again, not just memories, but lessons. I wrote about trust, about silence, about how betrayal teaches you who you are when everything's stripped away. I wrote for my grandchildren, for the ones who'd grow up hearing two versions of the story. I wanted them to know mine. I wanted them to feel it in their bones. Meanwhile, my son kept pushing. He tried to sue me, tried to claim emotional distress, tried to argue that I'd manipulated him into thinking I was undocumented. His lawyer sent letters, threats, demands. I read them slowly, then handed them to my own lawyer, who smiled and said, "This is going to be fun." We filed a countersuit, defamation, harassment, attempted fraud. And suddenly, the game changed. He wasn't just the son who betrayed me. He was the man being dragged into court for trying to erase his father. The family split like dry wood, some siding with him, some with me, most just trying to stay out of the fire. But I didn't care anymore. I wasn't chasing unity. I was chasing truth. And truth, once unleashed, don't care who it burns. I started getting support from unexpected places. Old neighbors, distant cousins, even strangers who'd heard the story and reached out. They told me they'd been through it too, that betrayal by blood is the deepest cut, that healing takes time but starts with standing tall. I listened, nodded, thanked them. And every message, every call, every story added fuel to my fire. I wasn't alone. I was part of something bigger, a quiet army of the betrayed, rising one truth at a time. The court date was set. I ironed my shirt, polished my shoes, walked into that building like it was a battlefield. My son sat across from me, eyes cold, jaw tight, like he still believed he could win. But the evidence spoke louder than his silence. The judge listened, read, questioned, and slowly, the truth unfolded like a map. My green card, my deeds, his messages, his threats, his lies. And when the verdict came, it wasn't just legal. It was spiritual. The judge ruled in my favor, dismissed his claims, upheld my countersuit. He was ordered to pay damages, to retract his statements, to face the consequences of his betrayal. And as he stood there, stunned, defeated, I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just nodded, turned, and walked out. Because victory ain't about celebration. It's about closure. That night, I sat on my porch, watching the stars, sipping tea, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from justice. And I whispered to the wind, let the healing begin. After the court ruled in my favor, I thought maybe, just maybe, the storm had passed. But betrayal don't die easy, and family don't forget humiliation, especially when it's served cold in front of a judge. My son didn't show his face for weeks, but his silence wasn't peace. It was plotting. I started hearing things again, not from strangers this time, but from family, cousins, uncles, people who used to call me Baba, with warmth now calling me the man who destroyed his own blood. They weren't asking questions. They were choosing sides, and most of them chose wrong. I didn't blame them. People don't love truth. They love comfort. And my truth was uncomfortable. I became the villain in a story he rewrote with tears and manipulation, telling everyone I'd turned on him, that I'd thrown him out over a misunderstanding, that I was losing my grip on reality. He even told my sister I'd threatened him with violence, that I'd screamed at his kids, that I was unstable. Lies stacked on lies, and suddenly, I was the ghost haunting my own family. Invitations stopped coming. Birthdays passed without calls. My name became a warning. And through it all, I stayed quiet. Not because I was weak, but because I was done performing. I wasn't going to beg for love I'd already earned. I wasn't going to chase people who believed a man who tried to erase me. My daughter stayed close, her loyalty like a lighthouse in fog. She brought her kids over every weekend, cooked meals, helped me clean, reminded me that not all blood turns sour. One evening, she told me my son had started a group chat with the extended family, sharing edited screenshots, twisting my words, painting himself as the victim. I asked her to show me. She hesitated, then handed me the phone. I read every message, every lie, every comment from people I'd once held in my arms. And something inside me didn't break, it hardened. I realized I wasn't just fighting my son. I was fighting the version of me he'd created. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I wrote a letter. Not to him, to the family. A long, honest, brutal letter. I printed it, signed it, and mailed it to every relative who'd turned their back. I didn't beg. I didn't explain. I just told the truth. I told them about the report to immigration, the eviction, the lawsuit, the lies. I attached copies of the court documents, the green card, the property deeds. And at the end, I wrote, "You don't have to believe me, but you will never say I stayed silent." Days passed, then weeks. Some letters came back unopened. Some relatives called, awkward, apologetic, unsure. I didn't entertain them. I wasn't looking for reconciliation. I was looking for accountability. And most of them weren't ready for that. One cousin, the only one who called with sincerity, said, "It feels like a funeral." And he was right. It was. Not of a person, of a family. The version of us that used to gather around tables, laugh over burnt food, cry at weddings. That version was dead. And I was the one who buried it. Not because I wanted to, but because it had already rotted. I started changing things. Took down old photos. Removed names from documents. Blocked numbers. I wasn't angry. I was clean. My daughter noticed the shift. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was better than okay. I was free. Because sometimes freedom don't come from forgiveness. It comes from letting go. And I was letting go of the illusion that family means loyalty. It doesn't. Family means history. Loyalty is a choice. And most of mine had chosen wrong. I started spending more time alone, walking, reading, writing. I found peace in solitude, in the quiet hum of a life no longer tied to people who saw me as disposable. I started planning a trip, not far, just somewhere new, somewhere untouched by betrayal. My daughter offered to come. I told her no. I needed to do this alone. She understood. She always did. Before I left, I stood in the living room, looked around, and whispered, "This is mine." Not the house. The story. The pain. The healing. All of it. Mine. And no one, not my son, not the family, not the whispers, could take that away. After the funeral of the family's unity, after the letters and the silence and the courtroom victory, I thought maybe the story had reached its peak. But betrayal has a way of echoing long after the first strike, and my son's desperation became the next chapter, louder, messier, more dangerous than before. He had lost the house, lost the lawsuit, lost the mask he wore in front of the family, but he hadn't lost his hunger, and hunger makes men reckless. He started showing up at places I frequented, the market, the mosque, even the park where I walked at dusk, not to speak, not to apologize, but to stare, to remind me he was still there, still circling, still waiting for a crack in my armor. His eyes carried something I hadn't seen before, not just anger, but desperation, the kind that makes a man gamble with everything because he's already lost too much. I ignored him at first, kept walking, kept shopping, kept praying, but inside I felt the weight of his gaze, the way it tried to pull me back into the storm. My daughter noticed too. She told me he'd been calling her, begging for money, claiming he was broke, that his wife had left him, that his kids were hungry. She asked me what to do. I told her to do nothing, because pity is a trap, and I wasn't going to let him bait her into carrying his sins. Still, I couldn't shake the image of those kids, innocent, caught in the crossfire of a father's greed and a grandfather's resolve. Betrayal punishes more than the betrayer. It punishes everyone who stands too close. One evening, I came home to find a letter slipped under my door. No envelope, no stamp, just folded paper with his handwriting scrawled across it. It wasn't an apology. It was a plea. He wrote about losing his job, about debts piling up, about nights spent sleeping in his car. He wrote about regret, but not the kind that admits guilt, the kind that begs for rescue. I read it twice, then burned it in the sink. Because words without accountability are just smoke, and I wasn't breathing that in anymore. Days turned into weeks, and his desperation grew louder. He started calling relatives, begging them to pressure me, telling them I was heartless, that I was letting him starve. Some called me, voices trembling, asking if it was true. I told them the truth. He wasn't starving. He was scheming. And if they wanted to help him, They could, but I wouldn't. My daughter stood by me, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. She loved her brother, even after everything, and love makes people weak. I reminded her of the eviction, the lawsuit, the lies. I reminded her of the officers at my door, the whispers in the family, the funeral that wasn't. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and said, "I just wish he wasn't like this." And I told her the hardest truth of all. He chose to be. Because betrayal isn't an accident. It's a decision. And he had made his. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. I looked through the window and saw him, standing in the yard, staring at the house like it was still his. I didn't open the door. I didn't shout. I just watched him until he left. And in that moment, I realized something. He wasn't just desperate. He was haunted. Haunted by the life he thought he'd inherit. Haunted by the father he thought he could erase. Haunted by the truth that refused to die. And maybe that was punishment enough. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to destroy him. He was already destroying himself. I focused on rebuilding my own life, on planting new seeds in the garden, on writing new chapters in my journal, on finding joy in small things. My daughter kept visiting, her kids filling the house with laughter, their innocence washing away the bitterness like rain on dust. I started smiling again, not because the pain was gone, but because I'd learned to live with it. Betrayal doesn't vanish. It becomes part of you, like a scar, like a shadow. But scars don't define you. They remind you. And I was reminded every day of what I'd survived. My son kept circling, kept begging, kept whispering, but I stayed firm. I didn't bend. I didn't break. And slowly, the desperation began to consume him, not me. He lost more friends, more family, more dignity. And I gained something he could never steal: peace. Because peace isn't about silence. It's about strength. And I had found mine in the ashes of betrayal. Here's part 6 of your dramatic betrayal series, Hamza, a full 1,000-word continuous paragraph, keeping the raw, emotional, cinematic tone alive. This chapter explores the son's collapse into desperation and the father's reckoning with the weight of betrayal. The weeks after his desperation turned into something darker felt like watching a slow-motion train wreck, a man unraveling thread by thread until there was nothing left but the bare bones of regret he refused to admit, and I could see it in his eyes every time he appeared at the edges of my life, hovering like a shadow that couldn't decide if it wanted to beg or to strike. He had lost the lawsuit, lost the house, lost the family's sympathy, but he hadn't lost his pride, and pride is the cruelest master, dragging him deeper into debts, into lies, into nights spent in bars whispering his version of the story to anyone who'd listen. People started telling me they'd seen him drunk, ranting about betrayal, about how his father had ruined him, about how he was the rightful heir to everything I owned. I didn't respond. I didn't chase the rumors. I let them float like smoke. Because smoke eventually clears and truth remains. My daughter kept visiting, her loyalty the only anchor in a sea of shifting tides, and she told me he'd tried calling her again, this time not with pleas but with threats, saying she was siding with me against blood, saying she'd regret it when he took back what was his. She cried when she told me, not because she feared him, but because she feared what he'd become. The brother she once loved, now a stranger with venom in his voice. I held her hand, steady, and told her the truth. He's already lost. Don't let him drag you down with him. But betrayal doesn't just vanish when you win in court. It lingers, it festers, it waits for cracks, and I could feel it pressing against the walls of my peace. One night, I woke to the sound of glass shattering. I rushed to the living room and found the window broken, shards glittering like stars on the floor, and though nothing was stolen, I knew who it was. He hadn't come for things. He'd come for fear. He wanted me to feel unsafe in my own home, to doubt the strength I'd built, to wonder if the storm was truly over. But I didn't call the police. I swept the glass, boarded the window, and sat in the dark, waiting. Because sometimes silence is louder than sirens, and I wanted him to know I wasn't shaken. Days later, another letter arrived, this one angrier, messier, words scratched like claws across the page. He accused me of ruining his life, of turning the family against him, of stealing his future. He demanded money, demanded property, demanded respect. I read it once, then folded it, placed it in the file with all the others. Evidence. Proof. A record of a man drowning in his own lies. My lawyer told me we could press charges, escalate, tighten the noose. I told him no, because punishment was already happening, not in court, but in his soul. He was collapsing, and collapse is the cruelest justice. My daughter asked me if I ever missed him, if I ever wished things had gone differently. I thought about it, long and hard, and finally said, I missed the boy he was, not the man he became. And that was the truth. I missed the child who used to run into my arms, who used to laugh at silly jokes, who used to cry when I left for work. But that boy was gone, buried under greed and pride, and I couldn't resurrect him. I could only mourn him. Betrayal is a funeral without a body, a grief that never ends, and I was learning to live with it. I started spending more time in the garden, planting flowers, trimming hedges, finding beauty in small things. Neighbors stopped by, complimented the changes, asked if I was okay. I smiled, nodded, said I was just cleaning up. They didn't need the details. The truth was mine. One evening, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon, and I realized something. I wasn't just surviving. I was rebuilding. Betrayal had stripped me bare, but it had also given me clarity, the kind that comes only when you've lost everything you thought was secure. I knew who I was now. I knew who my daughter was. I knew who my son had chosen to be. And I knew I wasn't broken. I was awake. The collapse of the pretender wasn't my tragedy. It was his. And I wasn't going to carry it anymore. I whispered to the night, this is my story. And it's not over yet. The collapse didn't end with broken windows or burned letters. It kept unraveling like a rope frayed at every edge, and by the time the dust settled, my son was no longer just desperate. He was hollow, a man stripped of dignity, wandering through the ruins of choices he refused to own, and I could see it in the way he carried himself, shoulders bent, eyes darting, voice trembling whenever he tried to speak to anyone who still tolerated him. He had lost his wife, who packed her bags one night and left with the kids, tired of living in the shadow of his bitterness, tired of hearing him curse my name instead of fixing his own mistakes. He had lost his job, fired after too many absences, too many drunken rants, too many excuses. And he had lost the family, most of whom now avoided him, not because they believed me entirely, but because they couldn't stomach the chaos he carried like a disease. I watched from a distance, not with joy, not with pity, but with a strange heaviness, because betrayal doesn't just punish the betrayer. It punishes the bloodline, the legacy, the name. My daughter told me she'd seen him wandering near the old neighborhood, muttering to himself, asking strangers for money, and she asked me if I felt guilty. I thought about it, long and hard, and finally said, guilt belongs to the guilty. Because I hadn't chosen this path. He had. Still, I couldn't shake the weight of legacy. The thought that my grandchildren would grow up with a father broken by greed and a grandfather hardened by betrayal. What story would they inherit? What truth would they carry? I started writing again, not just memories or lessons, but a kind of testament, a record of everything that had happened, every lie, every truth, every scar. I wanted them to know the story from my mouth, not his. I wanted them to understand that betrayal is a choice, and choices shape destiny. One evening, I sat in the garden, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine, and I thought about the boy he used to be, the boy who once asked me if the stars could hear prayers. I remembered telling him yes, that the stars carried our words into the night, that nothing spoken with sincerity was ever lost. And I wondered if that boy still lived somewhere inside the man who now cursed my name. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I was moving forward. My daughter suggested therapy, not for me, but for him, said maybe if he got help, he could find his way back. I shook my head. Therapy can heal wounds, but it can't resurrect trust. And trust was dead. Still, I prayed for him, not for reconciliation, but for peace, because even in betrayal, even in collapse, he was still my son, and blood doesn't vanish. It stains. The nights grew quieter, the house steadier, but inside me, the weight of legacy pressed harder. I thought about my own father, about the sacrifices he made, about the lessons he taught me, and I wondered what he would say if he saw this mess. Would he blame me? Would he tell me I'd failed? Or would he remind me that betrayal is older than blood, that Cain and Abel were brothers too, and history repeats itself in every generation? I didn't know, but I knew this. I wasn't going to let betrayal define me. I was going to let it refine me. I started teaching my grandchildren small lessons: honesty, patience, resilience. I told them stories about loyalty, about kindness, about how truth is the strongest weapon in the world. They listened, wide-eyed, innocent, unaware of the storm that had shaped those words. And in their laughter, in their questions, in their hugs, I found something I thought I'd lost: hope. Because legacy isn't just about blood. It's about what you leave behind in hearts. My son kept circling, kept trying to claw his way back, but his claws were dull now, his voice weaker, his lies transparent. He was collapsing, and I was rising, not with arrogance, but with clarity. Betrayal had stripped me bare, but it had also given me vision, the kind that sees beyond pain, beyond anger, beyond loss. I knew who I was now. I knew what I stood for. And I knew that legacy wasn't about him anymore. It was about me, my daughter, my grandchildren, the truth we carried, the strength we built. One night, I stood on the porch, watching the stars, and I whispered the same words I'd told him years ago. The stars hear prayers. But this time, the prayer wasn't for him. It was for me, for peace, for strength, for legacy. And as the night swallowed my words, I felt lighter, stronger, ready. Because betrayal may scar, but it doesn't kill. And I was still here, still standing, still writing, still alive. By the time the dust of lawsuits and shattered windows had settled, my son was no longer a man fighting for dignity, but a shadow wandering through the ruins of his own choices, and the isolation that wrapped around him was thicker than any punishment a court could deliver, because loneliness is the cruelest sentence, and he was serving it without parole. He had lost his wife, who had packed her bags and left with the children, tired of living in the echo of his bitterness, tired of hearing him curse my name instead of fixing his own mistakes, and he had lost his job, fired after too many absences, too many drunken rants, too many excuses. He had lost the family, most of whom now avoided him, not because they believed me entirely, but because they couldn't stomach the chaos he carried like a disease. And so he wandered, muttering to himself, begging strangers for money, sleeping in borrowed rooms. A man who once thought he could erase me now erased by his own arrogance. My daughter told me she'd seen him once, sitting on a bench outside the old neighborhood, head in his hands, whispering to no one, and she asked me if I felt pity. I thought about it, long and hard, and finally said, pity is wasted on those who choose destruction. Because betrayal isn't an accident. It's a decision, and he had made his. Still, I couldn't shake the image of those children, innocent, caught in the crossfire of a father's greed and a grandfather's resolve, and I wondered what story they would inherit. what truth they would carry, what scars they would bear. I started writing again, not just memories or lessons, but a kind of confession, a record of everything that had happened, every lie, every truth, every scar. I wanted them to know the story from my mouth, not his. I wanted them to understand that betrayal is a choice, and choices shape destiny. One evening, I sat in the garden, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine, and I thought about the boy he used to be, the boy who once asked me if the stars could hear prayers, and I remembered telling him yes, that the stars carried our words into the night, that nothing spoken with sincerity was ever lost. And I wondered if that boy still lived somewhere inside the man who now cursed my name. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I was moving forward. My daughter suggested therapy, not for me, but for him, said maybe if he got help, he could find his way back. I shook my head. Therapy can heal wounds, but it can't resurrect trust. And trust was dead. Still, I prayed for him, not for reconciliation, but for peace, because even in betrayal, even in collapse, he was still my son, and blood doesn't vanish. It stains. The nights grew quieter, the house steadier, but inside me, the weight of legacy pressed harder. I thought about my own father, about the sacrifices he made, about the lessons he taught me, and I wondered what he would say if he saw this mess. Would he blame me? Would he tell me I'd failed? Or would he remind me that betrayal is older than blood, that Cain and Abel were brothers too, and history repeats itself in every generation? I didn't know, but I knew this. I wasn't going to let betrayal define me. I was going to let it refine me. I started teaching my grandchildren small lessons: honesty, patience, resilience. I told them stories about loyalty, about kindness, about how truth is the strongest weapon in the world. They listened, wide-eyed, innocent, unaware of the storm that had shaped those words. And in their laughter, in their questions, in their hugs, I found something I thought I'd lost: hope. Because legacy isn't just about blood. It's about what you leave behind in hearts. My son kept circling, kept trying to claw his way back, but his claws were dull now, his voice weaker, his lies transparent. He was collapsing, and I was rising, not with arrogance, but with clarity. Betrayal had stripped me bare, but it had also given me vision, the kind that sees beyond pain, beyond anger, beyond loss. I knew who I was. Now, I knew what I stood for, and I knew that legacy wasn't about him anymore. It was about me, my daughter, my grandchildren, the truth we carried, the strength we built. One night, I stood on the porch, watching the stars, and I whispered the same words I'd told him years ago. The stars hear prayers. But this time, the prayer wasn't for him. It was for me, for peace, for strength, for legacy. And as the night swallowed my words, I felt lighter, stronger, ready. Because betrayal may scar, but it doesn't kill. And I was still here, still standing, still writing, still alive. It was inevitable that the storm would circle back, that silence would break into confrontation. And when it finally happened, it wasn't in a courtroom or a letter or a whisper, but face to face, raw and unfiltered, the kind of moment that strips away every mask and leaves only the truth standing naked between two people who once shared blood and now shared nothing but scars. He showed up unannounced, his face gaunt, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes burning with a mix of rage and desperation. And for a moment, I saw not the man who betrayed me, but the boy who once clung to my hand, begging me not to leave for work. And that memory almost softened me. Almost, but not enough. He didn't knock. He barged in, shouting, accusing, demanding, his voice cracking under the weight of his own collapse. He called me a thief, a liar, a manipulator, said I had poisoned the family against him, said I had stolen his future, and every word dripped with venom. But beneath the venom was fear, the kind of fear that comes when a man realizes he has nothing left to lose. I let him speak, let him pour out his rage, let him spit every accusation he could muster, and when he finally stopped, chest heaving, eyes wild, I stood up slowly, looked him in the face, and said the words I had carried like stones in my chest. You betrayed me. You tried to erase me. You reported me to immigration, hoping to steal what I built, and when that failed, you tried to destroy my name. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed yourself, and now you're living in the ruins of your own choices. The room went silent, heavy, suffocating, and for the first time, he didn't have a comeback. He just stared, trembling, like the truth had finally pierced the armor of lies he'd wrapped around himself. My daughter was there too, standing in the doorway, tears in her eyes, watching her brother unravel, and she whispered, "Why? Why did you do this?" He turned to her, tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Betrayal robs men of language, and he was mute now, his silence louder than his rage. I walked to the table, pulled out the folder I had kept ready for this moment. The green card, the deeds, the court documents, the eviction notice, and I laid them out one by one, like evidence in a trial that needed no judge. "This is the truth," I said. "This is what you tried to erase. And this is why you lost." He looked at the papers, his face pale, his hands shaking, and for a moment I thought he might collapse right there. But instead, he laughed, a hollow, broken laugh that carried no joy, only despair. "You think you won," he said, voice trembling. "But you lost me. You lost your son." And I looked him in the eyes and said the hardest words I've ever spoken. "I didn't lose you. You lost yourself. And I refused to carry your corpse." My daughter gasped, but she didn't interrupt. She knew the truth needed to be spoken, even if it cut like a blade. He staggered back, eyes wide, lips trembling, and for a moment I thought he might strike me, but he didn't. He just stood there, broken, defeated, stripped of every illusion. And then he left, slamming the door behind him, his footsteps echoing down the street like the last notes of a funeral march. The house was quiet again, but the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean, sharp, final. My daughter hugged me, sobbing, and I held her, steady, strong, unbroken. "It's over," I whispered. "The truth has been spoken, and now we heal." That night, I sat on the porch, watching the stars, and I thought about legacy, about scars, about the way betrayal reshapes not just families but futures. I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And though the wound would never fully heal, it had become part of me, a scar that told a story, a scar that carried strength. Betrayal had tried to erase me, but I was still here, still standing, still alive, and the story wasn't his anymore. It was mine. The confrontation had ended, the truth had been spoken, but endings aren't just words, they're actions, and I knew that if I wanted peace, if I wanted dignity, if I wanted to reclaim the life betrayal had tried to erase, I had to do more than speak. I had to act. And so I began the final chapter of this storm, not with rage, not with vengeance, but with clarity sharper than any blade. The morning after he stormed out of my house, I sat at the table with my daughter, spread out the documents one last time, and told her, "This is ours now. He has no claim, no right, no power." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and I could see the relief wash over her like sunlight breaking through clouds. I called my lawyer, finalized the transfer of assets, sealed every corner of my estate so there would be no loopholes, no cracks, no way for him to crawl back in. I drafted letters to the banks, to the tenants, to the family members who still lingered in doubt, and I told them plainly, my son is no longer part of my legacy. He chose betrayal, and betrayal has consequences. Some call me harsh. Some begged me to reconsider. But I didn't bend. Mercy without accountability is weakness, and I wasn't weak anymore. I was awake. At the next family gathering, smaller now, quieter, stripped of the noise of those who had chosen sides, I stood up, folder in hand, and laid out the truth one final time. I showed them the green card, the deeds, the court rulings, the eviction notice. I told them about the officers at my door, the lies, the lawsuit, the confrontation. And then I said the words that sealed the chapter. He is no longer my son. He is a stranger, and strangers have no claim here. The room went silent, heavy, but not suffocating. It was the silence of acceptance, the silence of truth finally settling into bones. My daughter hugged me, her children clung to my arms, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, freedom. Because betrayal binds you, chains you to pain, but truth cuts the chains, and I was free at last. My son tried again, of course. He sent more letters, more threats, more pleas. He showed up at the house once, shouting from the street, demanding to be let in. I didn't open the door. I didn't shout back. I just stood at the window, calm, steady, unbroken, and watched him leave. And in that moment, I realized something. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate is heavy, and I had carried enough weight. I didn't forgive him either. Forgiveness is a gift, and he hadn't earned it. What I felt was something different, something cleaner, detachment. He was no longer part of me. He was no longer part of my story. He was no longer part of my legacy. He was gone, not in body, but in spirit, and I had buried him in the graveyard of betrayal. I started rebuilding my life, not just in paperwork, but in spirit. I planted new flowers in the garden, repainted the walls, filled the house with laughter from my grandchildren. I wrote more, pages upon pages of memories, lessons, truths, a record for the future, a testament to survival. I told stories about loyalty, about resilience, about how betrayal teaches you who you are when everything else is stripped away. And I realized that my legacy wasn't about him anymore. It was about me, my daughter, my grandchildren, the truth we carried, the strength we built. One evening, I sat on the porch, watching the stars, and I whispered the same words I had told him years ago. The stars hear prayers. But this time, the prayer wasn't for him. It was for me, for peace, for strength, for dignity. And as the night swallowed my words, I felt lighter, stronger, ready. Because betrayal may scar, but it doesn't kill. And I was still here, still standing, still alive. The final act wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, deliberate. I cut ties. I reclaimed dignity. I handed him an eviction notice not just from my house, but from my life. And in doing so, I found something betrayal could never steal: peace. This is what I did after catching them. I survived. I rebuilt. I rose. And though something shattered inside me, though trust will never be the same, I am stronger now, sharper now, freer now. Betrayal tried to erase me, but I wrote the ending myself. And the ending is this: I am still here, and I always will be.